On May 5th, it was confirmed that the Right Honourable David Johnston would be willing to appear on June 6th.
So June 6th, that's the date that Special Rapporteur David Johnston has offered to appear before a House committee to explain his recommendation a public inquiry into foreign election meddling is not needed. But opposition MPs, they want Johnston to appear as soon as possible, and they're still pushing for an independent inquiry led by someone who's not David Johnston, someone chosen by Parliament, not the Prime Minister. So, will the government stick with Johnston and his recommendations? It's time to bring in the power panel on this. Sherelle Evelyn is the managing editor of the Hill Times. Vandana Katar is a political consultant and former advisor to Prime Minister Trudeau. James Moore is a senior advisor at Dentons and a former Conservative cabinet minister. And Andrew Thompson is a former Saskatchewan cabinet minister, now chief of government relations at the University of Toronto. Okay, James, let's start with you. This committee meeting today was called to summon David Johnston. He's already agreed to appear, so all of that aside. He spelled out his reasons in the report. What new facts do you think can be revealed at a committee hearing?
Well, I think to actually hear him respond to some of the questions, and I think a fundamental question is why are his observations and his path forward, why should that hold more weight than the majority of the Canadian Parliament? You know, a lot gets talked about the NDP Liberal Supply and Confidence Agreement, but people should actually read it. And actually, if you read, and I'm looking to a second screen here, Article 7 of the Confidence and Supply Agreement, number 7 is making democracy work for people, recognizing our shared commitment to maintaining the health of our democracy and the need to remove barriers to voting and participation. We will work with the government and Elections Canada for more voting. Now, right to the very heart of this democracy and right to the very heart of the agreement that holds the Liberals and the NDP in power is a commitment to making sure we're removing barriers. Well, among those barriers that's been exposed, I think, pretty substantially, is the threat to people across this country, the threat to their families, the threat to a member of Parliament, former cabinet minister's family, and the incursion of foreign interests into our Canadian elections. So, you know, I think there's a fundamental decision here that needs to be made by members of Parliament, particularly the New Democrats, about their confidence in supply agreement, a pillar of which is a commitment to restoring faith of Canadians in Canadian democracy. So I think David Johnston, I think one of the questions I think that should be put forward and observed is his response about why he thinks that his views should be of a greater significance than that of the majority of Canadian members of Parliament.
Right, and Andrew, I guess the argument we got from David Johnston on that was, I've seen all of the intelligence, and you know what we've seen in the media is not necessarily the whole story. That was certainly the clear central message he had yesterday. But James raises a very good point. A majority of parliamentarians did vote for a public inquiry, and yet here we are, right? Which is, it's kind of a perverse thing about the way the House of Commons functions on this. So, I mean, what's your sense of what we might get from Johnston when he testifies at Proc?
Well, I think two things. First of all, this report was always going to go somewhere other than David Johnston holding more hearings on his own around the country about it. I mean, this was going to need to be studied by parliamentarians or some other kind of outside group to actually weigh the validity of the conclusions that he's come to. I do want to address the point, though, that James has raised and say that it is important to note that Jagmeet Singh has said that he, upon certain conditions from the Prime Minister, is prepared to go through the security clearance process and to review the data that went into the report, unlike Mr. Poilievre, who is refusing to either undergo the security clearance or to review the data. And so I think that is the point at which Mr. Singh will make a decision about whether this does in fact merit further consideration, or whether in fact Mr. Johnston seems to have landed in the right spot.
Yeah, Vandana, on that point, right, the refusal for Mr. Blanchet and Mr. Poilievre to take advantage of seeing the intelligence has certainly been, the Liberals are trying to weaponize that back at them. We had Ward Elcock on the show earlier today, the former head of CSIS. He goes, this is a grown-up moment to act like grown-ups, look at the intelligence, for the good of the country. I mean, where do you see that one going?
It's not going to go well for Mr. Poilievre, and I think it'll just help the Liberals get past this. I think what's going to happen is that if you want to showcase, it's okay to say, I disagree with the assessment. It's okay to say, I think the government has mismanaged it. But if you put out things like that, letters like rapporteur, and use hyperbolic statements, I won't be silenced, and also refuse to actually look at the information to make appropriate assessment and to share with Canadians that based on what I've seen, I agree or disagree with this, then you're losing credibility. Then you're not showcasing properly that this guy doesn't have it, but I got it. You're not showing that you're the person who can take this and handle it responsibly.
Sherelle, the argument that they'll be trapped right? They'll be bound by secrecy and silence if they look at the intelligence and not be able to hold the government to account. I mean, what do you make of that?
Well, I don't know how much water it holds. I mean, David Johnston has looked at all the intelligence and he produced a 55-page report. I mean, he had a lot to say. Obviously, there were things that he couldn't divulge, but he was able to say, I saw this, I have my reasons based on the evidence that I've viewed. I don't know that it is so easy to simply say, okay, well, if I look at it, there's absolutely nothing that I can say. I know that today the NDP leader, Jagmeet Singh, he's saying, hey, yes, happy to look at this information. I do want some clarification and some, conditions and some maybe promises basically on, what I can and cannot talk about, which is reasonable to not want to be hemmed in. I do maybe wonder if he's being, influenced a little by all of the rhetoric coming from the other leaders about.
But he also doesn't want to break national security laws and be thrown in jail. I think that would also be something you want some assurances on. Exactly.
So that's, which is smart. Cover your bases. But I do think it is purely a political stance, and of course these are politicians, and that's what they're going to do, is when they are given this opportunity to say, hey, do you want to come inside, look behind the veil? It's easier to say no than you can continue to poke at them from afar without actually having to know what you're talking about.
James, what's your take on that? Do you think it's a trap the way Mr. Poilievre and Mr. Blanchet are describing it, or do you think it's like Ward Elcock says, it's time to be grown-ups and look at the intelligence so we can have a proper debate on this?
Ward Elcock's right. I think Pierre should take the briefing, should be sworn in. But one thing that was said there by Vandela about that therefore Pierre Poilievre isn't doing that. Therefore we can point fingers at him not being serious. And as she just said, quotes, that's what will allow the Liberals to, quotes, get through this. This is not about Liberals versus Conservatives. It's really not. This is genuinely about people who are trying to interfere with our elections. And people can be critical of Pierre Poilievre or Mr. Blanchet. That's fine. This is all democracy. People should be free to be critical of others, and that's fine. But at core here, the government is responsible for this, and they threw Han Dong under the bus. They ragged the puck on this now for a few months. They brought in David Johnston and his stellar reputation and have sullied it because of the way in which this has all gone forward. They've ignored the will of the majority of Parliament and 3 out of 4 parties in Parliament who want, or excuse me, I guess the Green Party as well, who all want a public inquiry. And now they're playing this sort of gotcha game with Pierre Poilievre and saying that he's not taking the briefing, therefore we're going to get through. Come on, really? I mean, we're a G7 democracy, and we have people who are state-sponsored actors who are trying to interfere, bully, and threaten Canadian citizens in the Chinese diaspora here in Canada, and bully their extended family in China and threaten them for participating in democracy. This is a pretty fundamental question, and it shouldn't be about who's winning and who's getting ahead and who looks good and who looks bad. There are some core questions here that need to be answered.
Vandana?
I completely agree that there's core questions to be answered, and I completely agree that all parties should be united on foreign interference. The problem is that's not happening. And by saying no to looking at the information, to saying government, to getting a secret clearance, to look at it, to assess it, you're showing that you don't actually care about foreign interference. You don't care about what the public feels about this. No. All you care about is partisanship games. And it's the same reason we see what's happening in committee right now. What will be different? You could have had this conversation with Mr. Johnston himself, but you want to have it in public for a reason, for political theater. And that's all that is.
True. Well, sorry, go ahead.
I appreciate your answer, and you proved my point.
Yeah, well, Andrew, first of all, we do have this situation where the answers are there for them to see if they choose to do it. NSI COP is going to look at this. There are 2 Conservatives and 1 Bloc member on that committee. What if they all come out and say they agree with David? I guess there's 2 outcomes. They say they agree with David Johnston's conclusions, or they say they don't. I mean, where does that leave these things politically? Because this committee should be able to look at this relatively fast and render a verdict on it relatively quickly.
Yeah, I would say it's unfortunate that the report did not go into more substance as to how he arrived at his conclusions, notwithstanding the fact that obviously he is, has diligently looked at it. I don't think anybody doubts that. But explaining that kind of reasoning was going to be important to put faith back into the system. I don't think Mr. Poilievre's position is sustainable. I mean, it just is a ridiculous spot to be in, to say that you're worried about foreign interference but refuse to look at any of the facts around it, even to understand what the implications or how deep that was, or what the basis of that was, or frankly, whether it actually started in 19 or long before that, before the 2015 election. And so I think that there's a lot of questions that need to be, coming out of this. But the only way for the parliamentarians to have a proper debate is for them to have, a look at the report. And like it or not, that means they're going to have to look at national security intelligence, and they're going to have to do that under oath and having gone through the vetting process.
Sherelle, I don't get the sense that Pierre Poilievre will move off his position. He's not, he's pretty firm when he takes a position on things. But I wonder, Andrew says that position is not sustainable. Is the David Johnston position sustainable, right? When 70+% of people polled want a public inquiry, when the Liberals are the only party who think this process is legitimate, it may be logical to argue this, but it seems politically untenable over the long term to keep it going this way.
Yeah, it's absolutely, I think, unsustainable from, it's been a relentless onslaught since he was announced, essentially, as the special rapporteur. And, look at the fact that, when it came to his report and his press conference, the first half of it was just, him having to talk about and defend himself as why he was the right person to do this work, potentially. I do think that it does also lend credence to the idea that this does need to be taken away in terms of having that independent public inquiry, because we are talking about the politics of it all, and politics cannot be divorced from it. David Johnston was very firm in saying that this is something that Parliament should be dealing with. This should be in the hands of Parliament. Parliament hasn't proven itself necessarily that it's willing, or let's say willing, to take it outside of partisanship. And, so whether it is NSICOP, that is, made up of parliamentarians who, when we were talking about the Winnipeg, lab issue, Conservatives boycotted it. So there's always going to be some element of partisanship and politics when we are leaving it within the parliamentary realm.
So James, just as a final point, right, there's been more commentary about David Johnston, the man, than David Johnston's ideas and his findings in the report on Tuesday because of just the way this has happened. Let's say it goes to a public inquiry. Who raises their hand and says, oh, yeah, I want to lead that in this political climate and go through potentially what David Johnston went through? Because we've even seen some people criticize Judge Rouleau as liberal Justice Rouleau when they appeared at committee.
Yeah, it's not exactly not toxic, is it?
No.
The environment's not, the environment's not great. And look, I don't know is the answer, but I will say this about David Johnston. When I was Heritage Minister, I had the privilege of being responsible for his installation as Governor General, and as Minister, I did a lot of events with David Johnston. I think this circumstance is one of those tales where often a person's greatest characteristic can sometimes be your greatest risk or flaw sometimes. I think his phone rings and he sees the incoming call comes from the Prime Minister of Canada, and the Prime Minister says, I need your help. He says, I'm there to help, whether it's Stephen Harper or whether it's Justin Trudeau. And in this circumstance, I wish he hadn't answered the phone, because he's being drawn into, I think, a toxic environment. And a lot of conflicts that are legitimate and that are apparent and that are really problematic for him to be in the position that he's in. But if there is to be an inquiry going forward, I would wish that it wouldn't be him, that it should be somebody else. But as you say, this is a really tough environment. As we get closer to an election, it's only going to get worse.
Yeah, maybe he needs like a no-call list, like for telemarketers, so the Prime Minister's office is blocked from calling David Johnston in the future.